Hi, welcome to Spiritual Connection. I'm your host, Katie Augustyn. So I'm a spiritual energy healer, I'm a shamanic practitioner, and I'm a transformation coach. And you know, I started this show called Spiritual Connection because connection is one of my core values. It shows up in many areas of my life. And I really wanted a way to connect all of us with each other, and also to allow us to connect more fully with our own spiritual selves. So I'm happy you joined us tonight, and welcome to the show. So tonight, my special guest is Dr. Mark Goldenberg. Welcome to the show, Dr. Goldenberg.
Thank you, Katie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you were able to join us. So I'm just going to read a little bit about you to tell our audience. So Dr. Goldenberg is the director of the Brain Balance Center of Norwalk, and he is a board-certified chiropractic neurologist, which we're going to find out more about very shortly. And he specializes in the treatment of learning disabilities, dyslexia, attention deficit disorders, as well as spectrum disorders. And so he received his Doctor of Chiropractic degree in 1985, and he then embarked on a path that really led him to understand the complexities of the nervous system, and then he became a board-certified chiropractic neurologist in 1991.
That's correct.
So I'm really curious, what does a chiropractic neurologist do?
Well, that's a good question. So just like the medical profession have board certifications, the chiropractic profession has the same idea. So a chiropractic neurologist is someone who has completed their 4 years of chiropractic physician degree. But then I went on for an additional 3 years of postgraduate study in neurology, culminating in a board certification exam, the writing of a thesis, oral and written exams, and that culminates with what we call a diplomate in neurology. So in addition to that, I went on to study for an additional subspecialty in neurobehavioral disorders of childhood.
Oh, wow. Okay, that sounds interesting. So how did you get involved in this field to begin with?
So my original thrust of practice was really working with sports injuries, traumatic brain injuries, nerve injuries, typical types of musculoskeletal injuries, and then moved into more brain functional neurology, which is really the idea of how the brain functions and communicates and connects rather than looking at pathology in the brain. So the medical aspect of that would be looking for, looking for seizures, tumors, really strong pathological aspects of brain development. However, most injuries of the brain and most dysfunction of brain has to do with connectivity, imbalance, low stamina, lack of communication between the myriad of different brain systems that we have.
So does that mean that's something that, that we're born with?
So if we're moving now into the realm of neurobehavioral disorders of childhood, the answer is yes. And the reason that became really a thrust of my life was because my own son had various struggles in terms of his development. So he was very bright from a logical, concrete, black and white, literal, analytical standpoint, but socially, emotionally, from a behavior standpoint, attention, organizational aspects, there was a strong imbalance. So he was very, very smart, spoke at a very early age, and we thought he was on his way to Harvard. Used to call him a little professor. But as time went on, we would see other aspects of low frustration tolerance, poor coping strategies. He would put a shirt on, and if the tag was not in the right place, he'd rip his shirt off, but now he'd actually give you the shirt off his back if the sock wasn't in the right place. So this started impacting him in a way that was not allowing him to reach his potential. So luckily for me, a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Robert Melillo, who's written a number of books and textbooks in the field of neurodevelopmental disorders, started working with children with this idea of imbalance between the two hemispheres of the brain. We know that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain are totally different. And when one hemisphere starts to develop in a much more mature and stronger level than the other hemisphere, there becomes a disconnect. And this causes the myriad of symptoms that children have with neurodevelopmental disorders. So it's very hard to label these children with a specific diagnosis, although that's the current model. ADD, dyslexia, obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette's syndrome. But when you look at the brain from a bottom-up approach and start working on the beginning developmental systems in the brain, we realize that in order to get to the higher levels of brain function, which are behavior, good socialization, processing speed, we realize that you have to look at the most beginning brain systems that need to be in place in order to get to those higher levels of function. So that's what my thrust of work is today.
You know, in hearing your description, it kind of reminds me, you know, a lot of my work has been done with gifted children in the gifted education arena. And a lot of those characteristics that you mentioned are very common in gifted children. And it's interesting, some of the research that I've read talks about exceptionalities that cluster. So if you have one exceptionality, which could be a very high level of intelligence, you also have other exceptionalities, that it's extremely common, and that a lot of educators don't recognize this.
That's absolutely correct. So the children we work with, their greatness is because of their imbalance. So areas of the brain are really processing and functioning at a much higher level than a typical child. But exactly like you said, when you have certain areas of the brain that are working very strong, you will see other areas of the brain that might not be catching up as well, because the brain works with this idea of extinction. So the best way to explain this is that if you have a child with born with one eye that's misaligned, if you don't patch the good eye, that weak eye will go blind. The brain loves to use areas of strength. So if you have an area of weakness in the brain will always go to the stronger area at the expense of the weaker area. So the current model in school systems, for example, is they'll say, well, he's an auditory learner, so we want to teach him towards the auditory system. But when you do that, you're really playing to the child's strength, but at the same time, you're not stimulating that weaker area of the brain, and that area tends to continue to get weak. So what we want to do is focus on the weaker systems, the weaker side of the brain, to build it up so both hemispheres could reconnect and coordinate and synchronize like a finely tuned orchestra, which is really what the brain is. It's a symphony of billions of neurons all communicating and firing and wiring together like a beautiful symphony.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Well, it's interesting, though, because the work that we do with what we call twice exceptional children, sometimes it's thrice or whatever, it's more than one, is to start with their strengths, to get them really motivated to learn. And it's not just a style of learning, but it could be other strengths that they have, whether it's interest or something that they're already good at. Because a lot of times, in my experience, what happens is the schools only see the weaknesses. You know, not the learning style, but maybe they have dysgraphia or dyslexia or some kind of processing issue, and they don't look for the strengths. Now, this is just, you know, typical, but I mean, there's always exceptions. So I think it's really interesting to hear it from a brain perspective, because I really haven't heard it that way.
Yeah, and look, that's the whole idea, is to get the brain to where all areas of the brain are starting to communicate and forming networks with each other, because that's how the brain works. The brain has many different areas that do different things. But many of these areas are not physically connected. But when they all fire at the same time and they all work at the same time, they form virtual networks together. So for an example of that,
I was just going to ask you for an example.
Yeah,
That's perfect.
I'll give you a very good example. So the first time you picked up an apple as a child, you felt the smoothness of the apple, You looked at the apple and saw it was red. You took a bite out of the apple and heard the crunch. You tasted the apple and you smelled the apple. Now, all those senses that I just described are separate in the brain. So the olfactory or smell system is in one part of the brain. The touch system is in a totally different part of the brain. But at that moment, when you experience that apple, all those neurons fired at the same time. So now, when you think of an apple, all the different parts of your brain that experience that sensation start to fire at that exact moment. Wow. So you could almost smell the apple, you could really feel it, you could taste it. And the whole concept of an apple is now very real in your brain because all those separate systems connected at that one time and fired at that one time to give you a concept of an apple.
That's amazing when you think about it.
Right, and that's why people could go down a street and just see something and it'll trigger a whole sense of an experience that you've had at one time in your life, for example. Let's say you walked down a street and you saw a green picket fence. And maybe when you were a little kid, you walked by this house with a green picket fence and they had beautiful flowers and you smelled the flowers and the neighbor was waving to you. And when you saw a picket fence, that all came back to you because that all connected at that one time. However, when that connectivity is awry and when you don't have that ability for the brain to make connections, that's when you start getting these neurodevelopmental imbalances, and that's why children start to struggle because they have a hard time forming this connectivity in the brain because different parts of the brain are not able to form what we call synapses or connections. So by strengthening these areas, these weakened areas of the brain, and allowing both hemispheres to reconnect, now the child starts developing in a more typical way, and when they go through growth phases in the brain, which happens every 12 to 18 months, the brain starts to mature in a more typical way and they start to succeed and decrease negative behaviors, improved attention, improved focus, better self-esteem, improved processing speed in the brain occurs. So it's also important to support them metabolically. So part of our program involves nutritional support. So we want to make sure they're removing high fructose corn syrup, refined sugars, artificial sweeteners, colored dyed foods, because those colored dyes actually cause havoc in the gut and interfere with brain development. Good omega fatty acids, which are fish oils, which stabilize neuronal membranes in the brain. Probiotic to restore good flora in the gut while we're building up the nervous system. So it's a very comprehensive approach.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. So when you're talking about restoring balance in the brain, how else do you go about doing that?
We do an assessment on every child. So we assess over 50, 60 different systems in the brain. And we look at auditory systems, we look at visual systems, we look at proprioceptive or body awareness systems, timing in the brain, fine motor systems, gait, academic cognitive systems in the brain. We look at reflexogenic eye movements. The eyes are a very, very, very powerful stimulator of the brain. And many children with neurodevelopmental disorders have trouble with eye movement. Quick eye movements, slow eye movements, fixation eye movements. So the assessment that we do, which takes about 3 hours or 3.5 hours, gives us a window into the stamina of these systems, number one, the percent function that a child has in these systems, and we look at left and right brain in terms of strength and stamina in these systems from the right brain compared to the left brain.
How do you do that?
So, for example, let's take one system. Let's take the auditory system. So we do a test called the Dichotic listening test. We'll have the child listen to 15 pairs of words. The words are presented at the same time. So you might hear, one ear might get truck, another ear might get bus.
Wait a minute, back up. So literally one person's over here saying truck.
No,
and
not
the
a
other
person. It's not a person.
It's a,
so they're
it's a
wearing
recording.
headphones.
Oh, they're So it's
so
coming
they're
in.
wearing headphones, and they're stereo headphones, and this is called the dichotic listening test.
Okay.
Well, I guess
This
you
is
could
new-
have
this is
two
new to
different
me.
people, but that would be a little distracting. But this is an actual test. This
Okay.
is an actual test that's well documented.
It's been around for a long
Yeah,
time.
it's been around for a long time.
Okay.
So they'll hear two words
At the same time.
out of stereo headphones,
Okay.
truck, bus, at the same time. They have to separate those words out and tell us, truck, bus.
Okay.
Many children, first of all, can't tell us both words. They might tell us one, but not the other. They might just tell us more words in the right ear than the left ear. So by knowing which side of the ear, for example, when you hear something in your right ear, it's picked up by your left brain.
Okay.
So the brain is crossed.
Yeah.
When I move my
kinda
left hand, it's
sorta
my
knew
right
that,
motor
yes.
part of my right brain that's allowing me
Right.
to use my left hand. If a child hears more, let's say more on their left side, their left ear, and very limited ability to hear with their right ear, that means their right auditory system, their right brain auditory system is stronger than their left.
Okay.
So this is just one indicator of a right hemispheric strength and a left hemispheric weakness. But we have over 50 different tests that we do that could look at right and left brain. Now, what do we do with that? So, let's say we have a child with a right hemispheric weakness. We'll have them listen to these two words. But this time we'll tell them, ignore what you hear in your right ear and just tell me what you hear in your left ear. So what does that do? That allows them to, first of all, filter out distracting noise in their right ear, lateralize their attention to their left ear. Now when they hear more with their left ear and focusing on their left ear, that crosses and stimulates their right brain.
Wow.
So if we want to build up the right brain, that particular exercise using auditory stimulation will stimulate the right brain. We could have them use their left hand to just do fine motor work. That'll stimulate their right brain. We have specific visual types of stimulation that could stimulate the left brain or right brain. There are also different types of, for example, optokinetic stimulation, which are bars going across the screen that cause the eyes to move slow to the right, quick to the left, which stimulate the right brain.
Wow.
So all the things we do are hemispheric in nature. But in addition, there's a developmental component. So for example, primitive reflexes. You familiar with the idea of primitive reflexes?
Not that I know of.
So these are reflexes that all babies have.
Uh-huh.
And they're critical for brain development. They're like training wheels for the brain. So you have children?
I have one son, yes.
Okay. So when he was very young and you put your finger in his hand, what did he do?
Yeah, they close their fist.
They grasped it. So that's called a grasp reflex. So the baby doesn't know that I want to hold on to mommy's hand so she could pick me up. It's a reflex.
It's just automatic.
These reflexes have to be in place. But after a year of life, these reflexes are inhibited. They're shut down because higher level brain systems need to develop.
I see. So they take over from there.
Exactly.
It's like they pass the ball to.
100%. So I liken them to training wheels for the brain. When a child learns to ride a bike, they need training wheels.
Yeah.
But then you have to take the training wheels off because if you don't, that child's not going to be able to really fully develop and ride the bike and improve in their ability to ride a bike.
Right.
So we need to take the training wheels off. So many of our children have retained primitive reflexes that need to be inhibited. So that's part of our work as well.
So literally they've retained the primitive.
Absolutely.
Huh. I wasn't aware of.
So a child who might have a startle reflex, which is also called a Moreau response, this child who is locked in this startle reflex is in a fight or flight mode every day.
All the time.
Low frustration tolerance, poor coping strategies, emotional reactivity, argumentative, oppositional, defiant.
Oh, wow. I thought
had a
all
parent-
kids were like that now.
Well,
Just
you
kidding.
go through the terrible twos, yes.
Yeah.
But when you're 12,
Yeah.
and you're
no,
going through the
kidding.
terrible
no,
twos,
that's not good. No, it's yeah.
I mean, I had a parent tonight who I sat down with to review results of an assessment, and the reason she came to me, actually, was because this child is hitting teachers, hitting students, throwing chairs. He has an IEP. So I said to her, what's the IEP call for when he does that? Well, we take him to a silent room and have him read.
Restrain him too,
So
sometimes.
how is that building up the brain? It's not.
It's shutting it down, really.
Shutting it down, it's giving some form of accommodation, but you really have to build the brain up so this child's brain could be more teachable. That's the goal of our work, is to allow the child's brain to be more teachable so they can benefit from all the great things that the parents are doing, the school's doing.
Yeah. No,
Just like you work with exceptional children, and they're doing things at a much higher level.
Yeah.
So we want to get the brain to be able to reach its potential.
Right. I mean, I was just going to say the goal is, in every situation, is to have the child reach his or her potential. And that's really what it's all about.
Right.
So.
And whatever that potential is, who knows? But at least give the child's brain the ability to do what it's supposed to do.
Give them a fighting chance.
Give them a fighting chance.
Yeah.
That's right.
So this is awesome that this is available.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know if that many people, I mean, I guess a lot of people know about it. You've been around for a while, you have a lot of customers. I just wasn't aware of it.
Well, there are 90 centers now in the United States. So there'll be about 120 probably by the end of next year.
Wow.
I started doing this work before brain balance was even in existence.
Oh, okay.
And it was called hemispheric integration therapy.
Because that was your area of interest, so you followed it.
So it was called hemispheric integration therapy.
Okay.
I wrote a paper which was published in the Journal of Functional Neurology, Rehabilitation, and Ergonomics, where I took a number of kids with attention deficit disorder. And we used pre and post testing. The test we used was called a TOVA test. It's called a continuous performance test, where a child sees images on a screen and they click a button. If it's the target they're supposed to click on, if it's not the target, they don't click on it. And it gives us a sense of processing speed, impulsivity, and attentiveness. Doctors use it to titrate medication. So when a child shows an abnormal TOVA test, or Connors continuous, they have a lot of them, and they give them, let's say, 10 milligrams of Ritalin. Now they have them redo the test. So now if the test is normal, they know they hit the right dose.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I used it using hemispheric integration therapy without medication.
Yeah.
And the result of that test showed that the TOVA test was normal after working with these kids for only really 24 sessions.
That's great. So
I got the same results as medication.
So it's really, it's an alternative
Yeah.
to having medication for a lot of situations, I would imagine. Yeah.
There's no chemical imbalance in the brain. So unfortunately, that's what doctors say, that there's a chemical imbalance, but there is no chemical imbalance. So when you start introducing chemicals, you're actually causing a chemical imbalance. That's why you have, for stimulants, for example, that's why you would have appetite changes, suicidal ideation, agitation, personality changes, inability to sleep, because you're increasing a neurotransmitter called dopamine in the brain, but all areas of the brain don't need increased dopamine. So when other areas that don't need it get it, you're going to have all these different symptoms.
So you can't really pinpoint it.
Right. It's impossible.
Yeah.
It's not specific.
Yeah. Well, I wish I'd known about this 25 years ago.
Virtually every person I speak to says the same thing. But the good news is for these kids out there, look, 10 million children are on stimulant medication in the United States alone.
It's crazy.
So, I mean, they're making all kinds of stimulants. You know, they actually, one stimulant called Vyvanse. The reason Vyvanse was produced was because kids started snorting Ritalin. They were getting high through snorting it. So they had to introduce a stimulant that couldn't be activated through the mucosal membranes in the nose. So they invented Vyvanse.
Wow.
So they're manipulating and changing these things, but at the end of the day, they're not getting to the underlying cause of these problems, which is a lack of connectivity in the brain.
So is it the case that the younger you start working with the child, the better result, or does that not really
That's true.
play out?
So, again, the brain goes through these growth phases. So the more we can get a brain that's going through growth phases, multiple growth phases early enough, the better it is. Just
better
like
result.
anything. I mean, early detection of breast cancer, early detection of colon cancer.
More time to.
So exactly. So the earlier you can get to these kids, the less struggle and pain they're going to go through in their life.
Yeah,
it's not to say when I see a 15-year-old, they can't be helped, because they can.
Sure.
Because the brain is still going through growth phases,
growing.
and even beyond childhood. As long as the brain is alive, it could change and grow with proper stimulation. That's why stroke patients have rehab where other areas of the brain go in and take over for the dead areas. The good news about children is there are no dead areas of brain. It's just weak areas of brain, like a muscle is weak.
So I think I'm going to have my sister talk to you. She she actually lives in Houston, but she has OCD, and she thinks it's fine. You know, like she doesn't even get treatment for it or anything.
Is it affecting? Well, I guess there's all levels of obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean,
I don't know
what
with her,
it looks like in her, but
yeah, good question. It manifests with her as germ phobia.
Okay.
And so it limits where she goes and who she interacts with, and you know that.
Very famous guy on television has that.
Who's that?
He's on that television show. It's a singing show. He's one of the judges. He's bald. Mandel is his name.
I don't really watch TV.
Well, his name is, I think, David Mandel or something Mandel. He has OCD, germ phobia.
Okay.
But he's successful, and
he
was a comedian, and now he's an MC on this show. I think it's The Voice or
one of
one
those.
with Simon Cowell.
I have no idea.
Anyway.
Well, anyway, I'll just have her call you, and you can
you
just
could
talk to her.
But OCD is a right brain weakness.
Is it Howie Mandel?
That's exactly who it is.
Oh, okay. Okay, I do know who that is.
He has OCD. It's well known.
Okay.
I'm not revealing any of his medical problems. I don't treat him.
Well, this is great. I mean, I feel like we could just kind of talk all night, but
it's incredible. I could talk about the brain for forever.
Well, maybe we can have you on again as a guest. Yeah. But we're going to wrap it up. But so basically, people can come to you at any stage in their life, and you do the evaluation, and then you give them treatment. That's basically in a nutshell.
So the Brain Balance program is geared towards children from 4 years old to 18, 19 years old.
Okay.
However, I do work with adults, not at the Brain Balance Center, but separately in my own
Well, we're going to put up your contact info so people do know how to reach you.
Sure.
You have a website, and thank you so much for being on, and we're going to wrap it up tonight. And really thank everybody for being in the audience tonight. And I'm your host, Katie Augustyn. Join us next time for Spiritual Connection. Blessings. Thank you so much for being on,
great.
Mark. Yeah, really, it's so
That's
interesting. I know, it goes